Good evening and welcome to Black in the Berg Live, to a wonderful conversation. I'm so glad you could join us. My name is Leslie King. I'm the founder of Black in the Berg, and I am also your host for today. So I'm looking forward to our show and the conversation. I'm going to ask you to like and share this video on your timeline. And I'm excited about our subject matter, also excited about our guest. And so without further ado, why don't we go ahead and get started with our first guest in the house is Derrick, actually Dr. Derrick P. Alridge is director of the Teachers in the Movement Project and a professor in the Social Foundations of Education program at the University of Virginia. His primary areas of scholarship are African American educational and intellectual history and the civil rights movement. He is the author of The Educational Thought of W.E.B. Du Bois and An Intellectual History, including co-editor of Message and Music, Hip Hop History, Pedagogy, and co-editor of The Black Intellectual Tradition in the United States in the 20th Century, as well as other accomplishments. He has also is a former fellow of the National Endowment for the Humanities and a former postdoctoral fellow of the National Academy of Education Spencer Foundation. So thank you for being here, Dr. Alridge. And my next guest is Dr. Wingfield-Smith. I'm so glad she could be here with us. And Dr. Danielle Wingfrield-Smith is the Associate Director of the Teachers in the Movement Project. Additionally, she is a research associate in the Center for Race and Public Education in the South at the University of Virginia. She obtained her PhD from the Curry School of Education, University of Virginia, and her Juris Doctor from the University of Richmond School of Law in 2014. And so I am her primary areas of scholarship, I don't want to miss that, are legal history, education, civil rights, leadership, and social movements, and education law and policy. So I'm so glad that you both could be here with me today. It's a special day to talk about Black Teachers Matter, bringing the past to the present. And I know this is the second time we have been in conversation collectively or either worked together in terms of you came to the conference, I think it was 2 years ago, and gave a presentation. So that was the Race, Poverty, and Social Justice Conference. All right, so without further ado, let's just get it started. Talk about why we're here. So let's start off just talking about a little bit about the Teachers in the Movement Project. What exactly is the Teachers in the Movement Project?
So, again, thank you, Leslie, for having us. We're very excited about being here today, and so thank you. The Teachers in the Movement Project is primarily, first and foremost, an oral history project that explores teacher activism. When we set out on this work, we started looking at what other scholars had written about African American teachers in particular. And we found that one of the main arguments was that teachers were not active in the civil rights movement. All right. And so that story did not square with me personally because I grew up in a community in the 1960s and the 1970s. I was a small kid and I grew up around teachers. One of the teachers was my mother and my aunties. And I would often hear them talk about their teachers and hear them talk about their teaching in public schools during the 60s and 70s, and they always talked about activism. In fact, they looked at their teaching itself as a form of activism. So that's kind of the genesis of the Teachers in the Movement Project. And then I get to college in the University of Virginia, and I started studying about it more, and I found out that there was this historical literature out there that kind of marginalized teachers' participation in the civil rights movement. So the Oral History Project, Teachers in the Movement, seeks to respond to that research by making the argument that teachers were involved in the classroom as activists by way of their pedagogy. So far, we've interviewed over 200 teachers. And from these interviews, we found that teachers were interlocutors of democracy, that they taught about Black history, that they were also activists in their communities. And that all these are forms of activism that we typically don't look at as activism. So that's kind of the foundation of it. And I know, you live in Lynchburg, and we've had an opportunity to come to Lynchburg to interview some teachers as well. So I'll stop right there because I know my associate director probably wants to jump in.
No, I think that covers it. I mean, I think that gets at the heart of the study. And it's a really great and necessary study. So I'm glad that we're having this opportunity to have this conversation.
So thank you for starting us off. I think it's interesting that I'm glad you clarify what you mean by activism, right? Because there's this conception or misconception about what it means. And often we think about activism as, protest or out on the streets. And certainly that may have been part of it, but I wonder if you may be able to give any specific examples of this pedagogy or how they used it in terms of curriculum or even the networks and organizations that Black teachers were a part of historically and how that went into it.
Yes. So from some of our preliminary work, we found that teacher organizations, Black teacher organizations, in all the states that we have studied, our study focuses on Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. And each one of those states had a Black teachers organization, right? And these organizations empowered teachers with information about the civil rights movement, about the Black freedom struggle, right? And they encouraged teachers to integrate these lessons of Black history into their curriculum, into their pedagogy. So we see these Black teacher organizations engaging in forms of activism along with these teachers and encouraging these teachers to do so. One of the best stories, well, we have many good ones, but one of my favorite stories is a teacher by the name of Jim Wright, who taught at Eau Claire High School in Columbia, South Carolina. He got his first teaching job in 1971 after he left the Vietnam War. And I asked him, was he an activism? He said, was he an activist? He said, absolutely. And he said his activism was his pedagogy. And he said, and his teaching Black history was his weapon, what he told me. That was his weapon in the civil rights movement. And so you probably say 1971, that's after the movement. Just to be clear, our time frame is from 1950 to 1980. So we call that the long civil rights movement. We don't just limit the civil rights movement to the 1960s. Go back as early as 1950 and we come up to 1980. So he was right in the midst of that time period and he was engaging in activism.
So yeah, Dr. Wingfield-Smith, did you have anything you wanted to add to that or?
Not to that. I think that's a great example.
Okay, so I'm wondering, since you're taking such a longitudinal approach to the oral histories and capturing those stories, what distinctions, if any, have you seen when it comes to what it may look like, the pedagogy or approach in 1950 compared to, the 70s or after Brown, if you will? So I'm wondering if you've seen any distinctions in there.
That's a good question. I haven't thought about that, but I'm going to start looking for that, Leslie, because someone's going to ask me that at some point. We haven't started. I've only written one article out of this research, and I plan on starting to work on a book. So I'm going to make sure I put that on my radar. But if I could just speculate some, I think I can identify some. So all of the teachers said they had great autonomy in the classroom. It was just amazing how much confidence school principals and parents had in their teachers to be intellectuals, right? So that's a particular theme that we study. So they had great autonomy to teach what they wanted to teach in the classroom, as long as they taught the basics, right? And so a teacher in the 1950 probably in the South was not teaching white children, right? whereas teachers who were teaching in the mid to late 60s through the 70s, there was a high likelihood or higher likelihood that they were teaching white students. So I think there probably was some difference in the delivery of their pedagogy because they were teaching to uh, a wider range of students across race and ethnicities. But I have not studied that in that way that you asked. So that's a great question.
Okay. All right. Well, let's take a step back then and talk about what inspired. I know you talked a little bit about it in the beginning. What inspired the research and what previous research does this build upon, right? So, can you talk a little bit
Yeah.
about that?
Well, I'll just go back. The inspiration for me growing up, I grew up in a little small town called Rock Hill, South Carolina, about 30 minutes south of Charlotte, North Carolina. And I grew up in a little country church called Liberty Hill Baptist Church. And all I heard about growing up in that church was about the heroic teachers who taught at the all-black high school called Emmett Scott in the 1950s and 60s. So I heard these stories all throughout the late 1960s and 1970s. I heard them from my parents and from my aunts and uncles, right? And so that was the inspiration. In high school, middle school, in fact, I ended up having one of those teachers who taught in the 60s, but he was still teaching in the 70s. So he taught my aunts and uncles in the 60s, but he taught me in the 70s. So I started actually interviewing those teachers then. I started having conversations with them then. So I traced the inspiration back to my growing up in the 1970s and being in church with some of these teachers. And you asked, what was the second part of your question?
About the research that this builds on.
You went out. I'm sorry.
The research. So about the research that this particular project builds upon.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So when I think about the genealogy of this research, there are a number of scholars who've done some important work that I think this work builds on. One of them, first and foremost, would be the historian James Anderson, who wrote a book called The Education of Blacks in the South, 1865 to 1930. I always get that date mixed up, confused. But what I remember about that book, he talked about the agency of Black teachers and the agency of Black people in creating their own schools during the Reconstruction period. And so that book was very inspirational and helped build a foundation for my work. Also, we have people like Vanessa Siddle Walker, who wrote an important book called Their Highest Potential, where she wrote, this book was about a school where she grew up, Caswell County, North Carolina, and where she talks about the teachers and the principal there who were heroic figures that she heard about growing up in Caswell County. So there has been some research out there. So we're not the first to get into that space. I think what sets us apart somewhat is that we're focusing actually on what were these teachers teaching in the classroom? What resources were they using? How are they using it? Right? And so we're trying to go inside the classroom to get a sense of how that activism materialized between teacher and student.
Yeah, Leslie, and I'll tell you, I joined the project as a student of Dr. Alridge's towards the beginning of the project, and so this is his baby project. But as I worked on the project, I did begin to take it on as also a project that I enjoy and love. And I'll tell you that what drew me to this project, Leslie, was the oral history component. There was work in the area, but the power of the griot and the power of hearing these firsthand accounts of these teachers who taught in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, their experiences and documenting that for their children has been a very rewarding process. Oral history is an amazing methodology, and I think that's one of the biggest and strongest aspects of this project.
Leslie, can I add one thing, please?
Yes.
I have to do this as a scholar. The name of that book is The Education of Blacks in the South by James Anderson, 1860 to 1935. I need to be on the record. He's a mentor of mine. I want to make sure I get that date right on his book.
All right, I appreciate that. So I wonder, though, just kind of going back, just in general, for you, Dr. Wingfield-Smith, because your work, your education and your research you have done around education. So what about this particular, project or about your study? What inspired you, just generally speaking, to focus on that as it intersects with the law?
Yeah, that's a great question, Leslie. My work really focuses on the desegregation efforts in Virginia and in the South. And so this project gets at one component of it, and that is what did classrooms look like pre-desegregation and what did it look like post-Brown, pre-Brown and post-Brown. And so this project gave me the opportunity to take a step back from court cases and lawyers on the ground and really begin to study the training, the education, it's one thing to read about, say, a young Henry Marsh out of Richmond, Virginia, going to a one-room school and having to walk several miles each way to get there. But it's another thing to hear stories from these teachers that taught the young Marsh and other legal advocates and hear their perspective. So it's definitely given me an insider's look at desegregation efforts, what schooling looked like in both segregated and desegregated schools, and how it affected the long movement. And so that's been a draw to me for this study, Leslie.
Yeah, so I appreciate that, because what we know, right, is that after Brown, a lot of Black teachers were actually fired, right? And superintendents actually ended up being directors of the bus department. Mm-hmm. So I'm curious about how, if you can speak to how that dynamic may have impacted, the approach of teachers, if you have anything to add to that. Or what was lost, when that happened, because the idea was that integration was kind of the promised land per se, but it wasn't fully the promised land. There were things that were lost.
Yeah, I can tell you that one thing that was lost was a sense of community. The local high school is often the center of the Black community. That space was sacred in many ways. It was rented out for parties, for dances on the weekend. Students came there during the summer for athletic events. So some of those schools shuttered. And as a result, the community lost a very important component of its cohesion. I can't tell you how many times I've talked to people. I think every town has a school called Booker T. Washington, or if it's not Booker T. Washington, it's named after a prominent person in that community. I find it fascinating. I would love to know how many schools called Booker T. Washington were closed down as a result of desegregation of schools. So that was something that was lost. Many of these Black teachers, I personally knew teachers who were in the 1980s, when I was doing my student teaching, who were teachers in the 1960s and 1970s that were no longer teachers. They were teachers' aides in the 1980s. And why is that? Because something called the NTE came in, and some of those teachers were pushed out as a result of that, of the NTE. And they were pushed out also because the Black schools were closed down. So there was just a number of things that happened that were really detrimental to the Black community.
Yeah. Did you want to add anything to that, Dr. Wingfield-Smith?
No, I think that's good. I'm just recalling several interviews that I've conducted where there is this theme of pride, right? We just finished a few interviews in Bedford, the Susie Gibson school. We did some work there, and if you know anything about Susie Gibson, that it's a great source of just pride and community, and I think that's something that in the translation was a bit lost.
I have one thing to add too. Thank you, and that is Several teachers told me that once they went to teaching desegregated into integrated schools, particularly by the mid 70s to late 70s, that they no longer could be teachers, that they loved being in the all black schools where they had great autonomy, but that there was more of a focus on standardization that was occurring across the country at this time, and that played a role in having, in them leaving the teaching profession as well, because of just what was going on politically with the teaching profession.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was saying teaching to the whole student was another theme, right? Where in these segregated schools, there was a bit more autonomy. I think Professor Alridge spoke about a little bit earlier, to not just teach the student, but fix their hair and make sure they were together and teach life lessons and memorization and scripture quoting. I mean, these were things that were very specific to our community that did not cross over.
Yeah, and the teachers were very educated. And that's the other piece, that Black teachers were highly educated. I don't know if either one of you want to speak to that, but I do know that was a reality.
They were highly educated, and we make the argument in our work that these teachers, we talk about Black public intellectuals. The teachers were the first Black public intellectuals in the Black community, right? And they were well read in many different subjects and areas. My mother was a teacher. She became a teacher in the mid 60s. And my grandfather thought that because she was a teacher, she should be able to answer any question that he asked, because they had so much respect for teachers and admired them as thinkers and intellectuals. So I think that's very important for us to point that out. So thanks for that question.
Yeah, did you want to add anything to that, Danielle? Okay. All right, so let's go back to the idea, talking about the methodology. And let's see here, take this off. Let's talk about the methodology of oral histories and the importance of story and history and telling these stories, and what's potentially lost when we can't capture, and why it's important, and why you chose oral history as a means or a methodology for your research.
Mm-hmm.
I know that was a lot, so
No. So let me just say that, we respect the written tradition. We are traditional historians of education in that sense. So we do archival work. We work the archives. But to tell a full story and to tell the story behind the stories, you got to talk to the people who lived it. All right. So as such, we want to hear those individual stories, because sometimes those stories do confirm what we find in the written record, but oftentimes they conflict with what we find in the written record, and they go far beyond what's in the written record. So that's why it's also important. As Black folks, it's important also for us to use oral history, because using oral history, we get to tell stories of the historically marginalized groups, such as African Americans, and our stories are often not heard, right? So that's why it's also very important. There's so much we don't know about the history of Black education because we have not talked to the teachers who taught in the classrooms, who were part of the community. So just methodologically, it just makes so much sense to do. And, our culture is a very oral culture. So Black folks are very familiar with the oral tradition. So it was just very easy for us to do it. And folks have been very excited about telling us their stories. So as we begin to write up our findings, we present the oral histories, the narratives, the stories. We put them up front, right? We put those up front and let the people tell their stories. We do interpretation, but we let those stories lead.
Okay. Dr. Wingfield-Smith, anything you want to add to that?
Just that I find great pleasure in telling stories that wouldn't otherwise make it to a textbook. but are just as meaningful and powerful, and gives us even more insight into the things that we study. And so I think it's a great thing that we're able to find these people and get these stories that would be lost otherwise.
Okay. So let's kind of connect the research and the history to today. And I'm wondering, how does the research connect to the work of Black teachers today in and outside of the classroom? And also knowing that there is a lack of Black teachers within the classroom, even given the fact that there's this most public educational schools are majority minority or majority Black and brown children. So I'm wondering, how do you connect this particular research to education today and teachers, specifically Black teachers?
Okay. Danielle, you can go first. I've been talking all the time, so you.
No, I've been following up. I mean, I think this is a good opportunity. The next phase of this research that's coming after is training teachers to use oral history to teach Black history. And I think we are beginning to make this connection that we can use these oral histories as a means to broaden these often sterile and narrow pictures of we're getting in our history books of our leaders in the movement. And so in that way, I think this research adds to that. And Professor Alridge can build upon that, but that's the next step, I think, to this work.
Yeah, sure. So, most people don't know the history of Black teachers. And each generation comes about that history of Black teachers, where Black teachers were very prominent figures in our community, where they were viewed as intellectuals, they were very respected. Most students they don't have a memory of it, right? And it's not in textbooks. So that's why this work is very important. We believe that if we get our work out there and that about the history of Black teachers, the roles that they played in the community, we hope that more people might become interested in teaching as a profession, that more African Americans might decide to choose teaching as a career. So that's one impact that we foresee having on the future. What's very important, though, is that these teachers gave us some great knowledge about how to teach Black history, social justice, and civil rights in the midst of a social movement. We're in the midst of a social movement now. Who better to consult than Black teachers who have already done this? So another stage in this research will be to put the teachers in the movement of the civil rights movement in conversation with Black and other teachers today about how to teach in a movement that's still in motion.
So using the research as a way to help inform a more liberatory kind of approach within the classroom that informs based on what's going on in society. So that's not just Black teachers, but all teachers
Right.
within the context. Is certainly helpful. And I'm wondering, you said something that's interesting about the role that Black teachers played historically in the community in terms of Black knowledge, intellectual history. And in the absence of that, right? So in the absence of Black teachers, and recognizing that we have there are certainly less Black teachers than we've had historically. I'm going to throw this out here. So where is that knowledge? And it exists, right? I'm sure it exists, but where, just if you had to guess, where is that knowledge now? That intellectual kind of rigor, or if you understand what I mean, like where would you?
Two things. I like to give a balanced answer to something like this. And I'd say that on the one hand, students, young people find it on social media and online. And that's not just Black children, that's everyone, right? And then on the other hand, unfortunately, I think it's been lost, right? Because I can only speak to my experience. I caught some of that, right? So those teachers that I'm studying now were in their final stages of teaching when they taught me in the late 70s, early 80s. Those are the teachers who were a member of the fraternity that I'm in now, encouraged me to go to college, encouraged me to pledge certain fraternity, encouraged me to read certain books, autobiography of Malcolm X, all of those different things, right? And I don't know if students have access, or certainly not as much access to those teachers, those kinds of teachers, as students had in the 60s, 70s, and that I would have in the late 70s, early 80s. So I'm afraid that some of it's been lost. And that's why there's such a need for Black teachers today. But not only Black teachers, teachers who are trained to teach Black history and issues of social justice. So it's not just, we can't put all the onus on Black teachers, but Black teachers are important. Yeah.
Right. Well, and Black teachers were part of a fabric, right? A network.
Right.
So it wasn't just Black teachers, but they were part of a network of organizations and connected to communities in specific ways. Which, then that also the next, about those institutions, right, within our community, and the lack of some, even though we still have some. I see you shaking your head, Dr. Wingfield-Smith. Did you want to add anything to this conversation?
No, I think that's good. I'm gonna let you all sit that right there. I think, and it's a good question, because as I'm conducting these oral histories, I often find myself in the midst of great joy and being thrilled of hearing these stories, lamenting the fact that our elders are aging and our Black teachers of the movement are beginning to pass away. And how many stories and lessons did I just not get because I'm of a different generation? And who is that being deposited in now so that we can carry the torch a little bit further? And so I'm hopeful that as we build out this archive of these stories and teachers, that there'll be someone in my generation and generations after me that will catch it. Because if not, as Dr. Alridge said, it'll be lost. It will be lost.
Yeah. I feel like we're losing something, Leslie. Give you an example. I can tell you that every time we set up interviews, whether they're in-person interviews or whether they are, we've been doing a lot of them virtually on Zoom and other platforms, that the teachers come to these interviews dressed impeccably, speaking the Queen and King's English, right? Beautifully. And they are so sharp and so poised. And I always ask them, were you like this in high school? Were you like this as a teacher? And they said, yeah, I've been like this since I've been in school. And I said, how did this happen? They said, my teachers. And when I hear this, and I'm sure y'all know some people like this. I mean, these people come 90 years old sharp as a tack. And they said, that's where he got it from, Black teachers. And I thought, man, that's something.
Yeah, and so I think Black teachers, as we've been talking about, really played a really important role in connecting the importance of their practices within and outside of the classroom to today. But I'm wondering about students. We haven't really talked much about the impact that it's had on students, or what role, or how did it buffer historically or inform the identities of or pride of Black students, given the context of society at the time and what was going on. And then, why is Black history so important to that ongoing, beyond just informing practices around social movements? Are there any other ways that it impacts students?
Yeah, that's such a good question, Leslie. I'm thinking about, so we have interviewed students of teachers in the movement, and Stanton, Bedford, Susie Gibson students. I can think of others. And the stories all sound so similar in that they we ask a question about what do they recall about their favorite teacher or the teacher that's had the greatest impression upon them, and they name, you know, their coaches or their English teacher, and they can cite or quote the very poem that they were, you know, forced to stand in front of the class, and they recall being told to speak up and make eye contact and project your voice, and you know, all of that good stuff that sometimes we don't get today, and they often, one thread I've heard, and that I've heard that from Henry Marsh about his teachers, I've heard that from other students in the movement, that is that their teachers, their Black teachers, were able to prepare them socially for the world outside of the classroom. Yeah, they came out knowing the poetry, knowing their lessons, the math. I mean, they came out sharp, but they also came out with a greater understanding of how they might have to move a little differently. And so their teachers were able to speak to the whole student in that way. And they just, to this day, speak so fondly. They tell stories about the teacher saying, you know, I will tell your mother, and messages getting passed from the schoolroom to the parents. And so it was just a different community, right? And these students, I mean, they don't forget that, and these stories are just really amazing to hear. The school song, the march, I mean, all of it. I can't even connect to it, but it's really great.
Dr. Alridge, did you want to talk about why Black history, beyond its ability to inform social movements, and I wonder how it might also help with identity, or, you know, pride, or in other ways?
Well, certainly the students that we've talked to, you know, people like Jim Wright, students, the men I mentioned at Eau Claire, told us that, you know, Jim Wright's work in the classroom, introducing them to the work of W.E.B. Du Bois, autobiography of Malcolm X, really influenced them and helped them see themselves as having a place in history. And that was beyond the kind of social activism component that it gave to them, you know, and as they were fighting the struggle, but it also gave them something they took with them along the way, right, throughout their life. And to extend on something Dr. Wingfield-Smith said, these students also told us that these Black teachers provided them with the social cues that they need to navigate society, how they would need to step in society, how they would need to move, right? And that was one thing that they pointed out that was extremely helpful, and that many, I think that's been lost. Many students don't get this today because they don't have that. You know, I just saw this on social media. Someone the other day on Twitter, a friend of mine, I didn't know he wanted to go to Morehouse, but he just had to need to say this on Twitter. He said, if I would have had a Black teacher in my high school, I would have gone to Morehouse. I didn't know anything about Morehouse. I wish I had gone to Morehouse. He is correct. I knew absolutely, even though my mother was an educator and went to a HBCU, I knew almost nothing about HBCUs and going to Morehouse until I got to graduate school at Penn State, where I had these students who were much sharper than I was academically, because I think they went to a HBCU and had more Black and went to an all Black high school. Now that's just me. I'm saying that, but that's what I think that's what contributed to their success.
Yeah, you know, what it also reminds me of, in listening to Dr. Wingfield-Smith, right? You know, how teachers in the past, and even I had some teachers like this, they could just kind of tell you like it is, right? Yep. They were in your face. But the reason, in many ways, I think, historically wise, because they were in the communities. They knew, like your parents, there's this trust or this relationship that was there, that may be absent, you know, today in some ways, right? So the relationship of knowing, you know, your families and seeing you maybe at church, in the grocery store, also has an impact on one's ability to connect with the students, right? Yeah, so I don't know if you want to say anything about that.
Other than you're right on, Leslie, I remember we had a Charlottesville teacher who told us that she purposely chose to purchase her home in the community that she taught for the very reason of being able to connect with her students and her students' family at a different level. And of all of the interviews, she's the one that people just bombard her to this day. I remember she just, her students just think of her as an extension of their family. And I think that is one of the reasons why.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, I want to give people an opportunity. If you're listening out there, you have a question for Dr. Alridge or Dr. Wingfield-Smith, please feel free to add your question to the chat. And I wonder if you all have, okay, here we go. We do have some questions. Where do we find Black teachers now for our school systems? What do you think would bring them to a region such as the Lynchburg area? So, I mean, I know that this is an ongoing issue, and I wonder if you can speak to why it may be, and it's probably layered, right? It's not just one thing.
It's a difficult question, and that's the next dimension of our work with this oral history project. We're working with an organization in Charlottesville called the African American Teaching Fellows. And the purpose of this organization is to encourage students to major in education and become teachers. And after they get their teacher certification, they get a small stipend for doing it. We encourage them to come back to Charlottesville to teach. That's been hard. It's been hard to get them to come back. It hasn't been as easy as we thought, let me say this. And that's mainly because teachers, when they get their degree, they want to go to larger cities. And that's been a challenge for towns. It's the same thing in my hometown back in South Carolina that has a rich history of Black teachers. How do we get them to come back to smaller communities is a challenge. I don't know the answer, but we hope to find out in some of the future research that we're going to be doing probably over the next 2 years.
Dr. Wingfield-Smith, did you want to build on that? I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, it's kind of a similar situation in academia as well for some institutions. Finding, professors, faculty, Black faculty. And so, I wonder, and I've been talking to a couple of friends about this, about cohorts of teachers who commit to a specific area for a specific amount of time. But that's just one challenge. I mean, there's the economic piece, the salaries, what teachers get paid, and then politically movements to reduce funding in education for other ways, for other types of schooling. So we know that those are issues as well. But certainly in creating a pipeline is helpful, right? And then there are other ways that we can increase teachers. So let's see if there are any other questions or any other comments that you want to share before we kind of come to a close here. Anything about this conversation that you want to, if somebody wants to get in contact with you to share their oral history, or if they know someone, how can they do that? Tell us about that process. That'll be helpful. What does it involve to be a part of the project?
Okay, so we encourage people to get in touch with us. First, you can go to our website, teachersinthemovement.com. Again, teachersinthemovement.com. And Danielle can provide our email address for you in a few minutes. I can't recall it right off the top of my head. But the process right now, because we're in COVID, what we do is we have an initial conversation with the individual, and then we set up a interview. And we do the interview over Zoom, or we do just a regular kind of recorded interview over the phone. It's up to the interviewee which way they would like to do it. If we do it over the phone, we ask them if they can find a photograph from when they were teaching, and could they share that photograph with us. We take a picture of it, we send it back to them, or they can take a picture of themselves and send it to us. That's fine. And then we actually put the interview up on our website. After we get permission, though, put the interview up on our website for students to use in their research papers. So some of our students, I teach a course on education and the civil rights movement, and my students use these interviews to do research papers. Sometimes they follow up and call the teacher to get more information or inquire about something that occurred in their interview. So you just write us at teachersinthemovement.com. Go to our website, teachersinthemovement.com, and then you can email us, and either Danielle Wingfrield-Smith, our associate director, will get in touch with you, or someone from our team will get in touch with you to set up an interview.
Yeah, through the website, there's a contact page. You can go through that portal or email us directly at teachersinthemovement@gmail.com. So it's teachersinthemovement@gmail.com. We would really love to get your story, or your grandmother's story, or your great aunt's story, or anyone that you know. We would love to include you or your family in our research.
Thank you for sharing that, and we'll share it again before we close. But I wonder if there's someone who's kind of contemplating it and they're not quite sure, whether or not they want to do it. Why should they contribute to this research? Why should they share their story, or encourage someone that they know to share their stories?
Let me because those stories are important to history and to posterity. We want people to know what these teachers did and the role that they played in our community. We want people to know this for generations to come. It's also important for families. I can't tell you how many times we've interviewed people, and they will have their children there with their grown children with them and their grandchildren. And when we're interviewing them, they're giving us information that their family members have never heard. Like, they've never heard it. And I would say a couple times a year, we receive a card or a letter saying, thank you for interviewing my grandfather. Thank you for interviewing my mother or father. And sometimes they'll say, that was a gift to us because they just passed away, right? But we have this hour-and-a-half interview that you did, videotape with their voice and telling their story. So that's why it's important. It's not just a gift to history, it's a gift to yourself, to your family.
Dr. Wingfield-Smith, did you want to add anything? Nope, you don't want to add. You're shaking your head. You think that?
I can't hear you.
I asked Dr. Wingfield-Smith if she wanted to add anything to the conversation, and she said she's good. We're good to go.
Yeah, Professor. You can't get it. You can't say it any better, right? It's a gift.
Yes, you can.
It's a gift. It's a gift to history, and it's a gift to your family for posterity. It's what it is.
Okay. We have one question about what is the next step in the TIM project. So what's the next step after you collected, your oral histories? And I'm assuming this is a multi-year kind of project. It's an ongoing project. And I think you alluded to it in the beginning, but if you could just talk a little bit more about what the next step or steps are.
Okay. So students, I have a team of graduate students. Dr. Wingfield-Smith is working with us, and we're writing journal articles to put in academic journals. I'm beginning my research on a monograph, a book on teachers in the movement, right? So we foresee not only us doing research based on these oral history interviews and the archival data that we collect, we're going to use them in our classroom, right? For our students to do research on these teachers, number one. Number two, we want to use this research in the future also to encourage other students to major in education and become teachers, right? So that's very important. And then another step, something that we've talked about today, and this is exciting, I think, and that is we are interested in teaching children how to do oral history. We're having an institute this summer, which will be our second virtual institute for teachers that will be online. And we encourage you to tell people about it and sign up for it. But the theme is going to be using oral history to tell our stories or to tell Black history. And the purpose of this institute will be to teach teachers how to teach their students, young students, how to use oral history to tell the stories of not only their generation, but of their parents and their grandparents' generation.
Go ahead, Dr. Wingfield.
Yeah, no, and just to clarify, and in all of these next steps that Dr. Alridge just mentioned, a part of that also is really focusing in on this pedagogical work that these teachers were doing in the classroom and pulling out those tenets, those very practical things that they gave us in these interviews, to also help teachers navigate teaching during the current movement. And so that's another part of all of this.
So if someone wants to participate in this institute, listen, I want to participate in the institute.
It's a great institute, Leslie. I get something different out. Listen, I've attended every one, and I get something different out of each one of them.
Last summer we had Bettina Love as our keynote speaker, so it was
fun. Oh, I participated. And well, it was virtual.
Yeah,
I went to a couple of those.
Yeah. So we're in the process of putting that together. We'll make sure, Leslie, that you receive all the publicity that we receive. You can get it out to your folks. We think that it's going to be tight because we had a number of people that we were not able to allow to be in the institute, so it's going to fill up quickly. So we'll make sure you get it, and we encourage you to encourage teachers that and educators to please join us.
Yeah, that sounds good. Yeah, join, encourage someone to participate. That's awesome. All right, well, I guess we're to the end. I don't see any other questions. Want to give you each an opportunity to share some closing thoughts. Anything that you want to share as we close?
Just a thank you, a very hearty thank you to you, Leslie, and for using this platform in this way. I think it's an amazing thing. I do want to clarify that I really want your oral histories, and you don't have to be in Virginia. And we mentioned it earlier, but I want to clarify that, Maryland, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Virginia, anywhere, do email us at teachersinthemovement@gmail.com or go to our website and teachersinthemovement.com. And I really hope that I can be, especially if you're in Lynchburg, my hometown. I'm a native of Lynchburg. So I hope to even be able to conduct it myself if you're in Lynchburg. But thank you, Leslie, for having me today.
In 2017, Dr. Wingfield-Smith invited me to do a set of interviews. We were in the snow and ice in Lynchburg. And whenever I think about that set of interviews, it was just a beautiful set of interviews. We interviewed some teachers at Mr. William Ford. What's his name? Walter Ford? What's his name?
Yeah, Walter Ford. Yeah,
Walter
he's since
Ford.
passed.
That guy was incredible. He really was inspiring to me every time I think about him. I still look at his video, but his interview. But him and the teachers that he had at his house that day, we ended up doing about 5 interviews. And it was like I was back home hearing the same stories that I grew up hearing about these heroic, inspirational, influential teachers. So we really want to get back to Lynchburg to make sure that educators, teachers in Lynchburg are very much a part of our study. And Leslie, we want to thank you for inviting us here today. This was a great opportunity for us to get to talk not only about our project, but to always mix it up with you because you always ask very good questions. You're intellectual yourself. So,
well, a little bit. I dibble and dabble. I appreciate that. I enjoy the conversation. I'm a lifelong learner. I appreciate your time. I think this project is critical. I think history is so important. We talk about who shapes it. And this is an opportunity, right, to not only be a part of history, but to inform, teachers, all teachers, and education in the future. So I know teachers have really played an integral part in my life. And so I thank you for the work that you do. Thank you for tuning in. And I hope that you stay well and stay safe and take care, everyone.
Take care. Bye-bye.